studies here. And our last panel is going to be focused on agency and cognition in human AI creative processes and creative workflows. So I'm hoping we'll get to think about, well, I will give you a preview. We'll just dive into it. Maybe we can, everyone can briefly introduce themselves. And while you introduce yourself, maybe picking up on Steven's question from earlier, answer how do you conceptualize or define agency? An easy question for your show.
Can I go first?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Steven Dow. I'm a professor in cognitive science at UC San Diego. I'm actually more of a designer, an engineer, I guess, from upbringing, but became a designer along the way. Now I'm in the cognitive science department, so maybe that's perfect for this panel. And you can get into like some of the work, the research that we do, but I'm trying to answer your question, I guess, or think about your question. I feel like I've thought about this a lot in the past. When I was a PhD student, we thought a lot about agency in terms of creating playable media, interactive media, trying to give the person consuming the experience agency over what they're experiencing. But I also did a lot of work on creativity tools, and it's interesting how then we were trying to give the agency to the user, and now we're sort of worried about giving the agency up to the system, and taking our creativity away. And so to your question, or to my question, I think of agency not as necessarily a property of the system or just a perceptual experience of the user, but something that kind of emerges between the two. That you need to have, the user needs to understand what's possible and have desire to take action, and the system has to be set up to deliver on those. And the system plays a big role in setting the right expectations about what you can or can't do with it. And the reason why, open-ended text chat with a LLM is kind of interesting is there seems to be no boundary of what you can ask. But you don't always get what you expect. So the interface affordance is that you can do anything with it. But the reality is that it actually is quite powerful, but it doesn't always deliver what you expect. And there's where you get a lot of gap in expectation. We'll get more into it, but there's a quick answer.
Hey everyone, I'm Mike. I'm a professor here at Northwestern University in computer science and learning sciences. You answered the agency question, I think, from an HCI perspective, and I'm going to answer it from more of like a learning perspective, which is, I think, like learner agency in educational spaces. Specifically in relation to AI, it's kind of interesting. I sort of feel like AI, especially chatbots right now, are doing this sort of these magicians who always like pick a card and you card you think you have agency, but then it's like giving you the card that you want to take. So I think learners interacting with these chatbots are kind of seeing this idea of like they feel like they have control over learning, but in a way I sort of feel like the models seem to be sort of pulling people along kind of like path trajectory that doesn't necessarily like maybe that there's more of an illusion that just going to have experience of agency as a learner.
I'm John Zimmerman. I'm a designer in the computer science department. Like Steven. Actually, I used to be a colleague of Steven's that he does. California calls. Pittsburgh's a tough sell. Very tough. I think, I want to just touch on this idea of agency I talk about some of my older work. So I was very interested in how do we make things that help people feel they're becoming the person they desire to be. So we focused on parents because mostly parents feel they suck. And so making someone that feels bad feel better is easier than making someone that feels excellent feel even more excellent. And this was the early days of smart homes. And so we were really interested in giving people more control, like in the space stages. You're going to control everything. It's going to be awesome. And we spent a lot of time with parents, particularly in the morning before everybody goes off. And in the afternoon when everybody comes back. And pandemonium, chaos, lots of feeling bad about your role performance. And what we came to realize was parents did not want more control over their lives. They wanted to feel in control, which is very different than being in control. And that responsibility travels with agency in an often super unpleasant way. And so one of the things we built in this space was a system that learns where and when everyone's going to be. And then, particularly when parents role switch, they're like, I'm the parent that takes them to ballet, but I'm not doing that today. And now my spouse has to do it. But I haven't necessarily given them great instructions on how that gets done. So what we would do is watch, can we detect when is there a child that probably should be getting picked up, but no parent seems to be moving towards that child. So it's a smoke detector for forgetting your kids. And it's not that parents forgot their kids a lot, but they worried about forgetting their kids all the time. In the same way, we used to worry about fire. We really don't. Like we're just freed of that obligation. So again, the pleasure in actually removing a responsibility, particularly an anxiety producing one, was kind of magical for us. And it made us think a little more like maybe agency isn't all that. Now we have to think more broadly of the whole action space when we're proposing solutions for like the felt experience that we want people to have.
Heard several sort of definitions of agency, and the what all of you said, like agency as negotiation or something that you negotiate with the system, agency as an illusion, and agency as a feeling or felt experience. And I'm curious, you all design tools, systems that are used in creative workflows or creative processes. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how do we design AI tools and creative workflows that allow us to have a felt experience of agency, or to at least allow us to negotiate agency with the AI rather than just sort of taking it away.
I might question the premise of your question. Well, because I think, a lot of people think about a trade-off between using these AI tools and having a sense of ownership and creativity and agency over what it's creating. And we sort of come in with that hypothesis originally and have found that surprisingly sometimes people tend to feel more empowered with the tool than the whatever other thing they're contrasting it with, that it's not necessarily automatically undercutting their sense of agency.
Yeah, follow up on that.
Yeah.
When do you think people feel more empowered with these tools? Because I can think of other examples.
Caveats,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I think everything is situational, and I think it really depends on their own motivations and why they're interacting with it. But it's just been a surprise to us. We've gone in with the hypothesis that this like giving over agency to the system is going to trade off with something, and have been surprised when actually they felt more empowered by these tools.
My student Cameron has been thinking a lot about sort of creative processes and sort of what is the role, how does AI fit within a process, right? And so we kind of think about a lot of what creativity comes out of is people who have highly developed literacies, and sort of they're able to combine different literacies in different ways. So you see these literacies colliding or kind of intersecting. And part of what it means to be literate is to be able to work with different representations of a domain. So for example, if you're a musician, you might be able to play a piano keyboard. The piano keyboard is a representation of a harmonic structure, right? You might be able to write music notation. You might be able to understand what a waveform looks like if you're a producer. And one of the issues that we're seeing right now is that you go on something like Suno and it's just like, hey, make me a beat that sounds like acid pop from like this genre, and it just generates it for you, and there's no intermediate representation. So a lot of what Cameron has been pushing for is like AIs that help us work within representational frameworks as opposed to just giving us the answer, and that supports at least we can start to imagine creative processes that like allow for divergent and convergent thinking and so on, more from a higher science perspective.
So my work's maybe much more narrow than this. We make AI things. We're not using AI to make things. That makes sense. And that the biggest challenge we're constantly facing is what people want. So they ask for unbuildable things, and then what we can deliver. Like, so we find technical teams suggest things no one wants, and other teams suggest things that are just ridiculously impossible to build. And it's like, how do we create the situation where we can find those harmonious intersections of capability and desire? And that we do that largely by going to very traditional in-person design activities, where designers aren't the ideators. They are the people making sure good ideation is happening, right? That they're facilitating. And to me, it's also like super important to get all of the stakeholders in the room. So we've been like trying to figure out how to use mediocre AI in the ICU and not kill anyone. And we're not assuming AI is going to be excellent, because if you look at the quality of data in healthcare, it's poor. So we're going to have mediocre AI. That doesn't mean it can't do anything, but the idea, so we had like the doctors were saying, please help us with sedation. It's really hard to know how much sedative to give people. And it's like, that seems dangerous. And then they're like, oh yeah, and our data's not so good because when they have a 7-point consciousness scale. So they'll say like, keep the patient at a 3. The nurse always says they're at a 3 regardless of what they're at, because if they put in a different number, they have to fight with the EHR. And no one ever makes a diagnostic decision without being in front of the patient. They can all tell what their conscious level is. So they're doing a great job of practicing medicine, but producing ridiculously bad data. And they're like, please help us. It's like, you are pointing to an excellent problem, but not an AI opportunity. So for us, it's really trying to surface that conversation of what is the space, what is the actual action space we have, and it generally comes from that co-location and like frictional arguments. Yeah, so that it's designers really seeding some agency there, that the ideas will always come from the crowd, but you're there to just sort of help process workflow.
One thing you mentioned was like not being able to identify that AI offers an incredible opportunity in the space. And I'm curious, question for all of you, when we're thinking about AI playing a role in creative workflows or creative processes, what do you think we need to know about, and by we, I mean the person using AI in the creative process, what do you think they need to know about AI in order to have agency or to use AI effectively in their creative process, if anything?
John, you should answer that first.
So, yeah. What do you know about how a pen works? What do you know about how paper works? Right? I think we don't need to know anything about it as long as we can use it. We can have a conversation with its material capability to surface ideas that are valuable to us. What do you need to know about electricity to use electrical? You know, I use power tools all the time. I'm much more familiar with saw blades and how they cut wood, but I'm not really worried about the electricity part. So I think it's how how close it is to the thing you're actually trying to do. I think if you're trying to do middleware for AI or you're thinking about efficiency, you better know a lot. But if you're much more in an application space, you just have to have people with you that carry that way.
Can I follow up real quick? Which is, one thing you said was that you need to be able to have a conversation with its like immediate materiality. Do you think most AI tools currently afford that, or most widely used AI tools afford that type of conversation?
I think that no, but I don't know that they need to. So I would say wood doesn't either. But there are tons of wood artifacts in the world we can use as references to kind of get people into a conversational space. So it's more having a set of exemplars of capabilities that support the conversation. I don't actually need the tool to do it because I think that exploration of more the detail of form giving is a different conversation.
Examples help, but I think playing with the medium is where you're getting the lessons and the feeling out the edges of what it can and can't do. The interface affordances alone are not giving you what you need. To your previous question, do they have what they need to know? Want to know like what kind of paths is this leading me down? What kind of biases is this potentially going to sway me towards? And you can't see that from looking in from the outside. In fact, you may not even become aware of that after interacting with a lot of time. So my philosophy is not necessarily take the AI tools as they are, but to think about how we can support the right kind of cognition, the right kind of learning experience around the AI. So how can we wrap, something around their interaction with AI that gets them reflecting in different ways, or that gets them sort of interacting with the data in different representational forms. I love that take on it. How can we scaffold their interactions so that it does sort of provide those affordances that the current AI doesn't, or just sort of leaves us a completely endless possibilities. So, scaffolding, I think, multiple representations are two strategies. And then the context of interaction, I think, is really key, and we can get into that. But I've been moving all my teaching, I've been telling people away from text and into live things. So to Brian's earlier provocation, there is a way to test people, not with text. And that has to do with like have them perform something, have them give a talk, have them do an oral, put them on the spot to think. And that is a truer signal, at least in this point in time, than something they turn in that's text-based.
I do a lot of woodworking too. I think about tabletop. There's a lot of really bad things you can do with tabletop that are really dangerous. That result in serious bodily injury. So I'm kind of wrestling with, do I think, like, how far can we push this analogy, right? So, like, if I'm working with AI, if I'm a creative, I don't care what field necessarily, but my job is to create something. Am I worried about, say, copyright infringement unintentional? Am I worried about, more realistically, maybe just like creating really derivative work that sort of feels sloppy, in that sort of AI sense, and not knowing if I am or not. I don't actually know if I know the answer to these questions right away, but I think a lot about the identity work that learners go through to become literate in anything. Like there's a process in which I'm like, when I was in undergrad, I am becoming a computer scientist. I wasn't a computer scientist, but I felt like I was on a journey to becoming. And after a few years in the industry, I sort of felt like, yeah, I am a software engineer. Like, and that identity work, like, I wonder if we're giving up some of that identity work and handing over the cognitive work to AI tools. So I don't know if that's a danger. I think those are the things I'm thinking about.
So add one thing, like part of the conversation we can't have easily with AI is cost, particularly for things that scale. So if you think of an architect, I can talk to them and say I have $100 million and they can tell me what they can build. Right, and so we can go from our ideas, we have an intuitive sense, or industrial design, or like woodwork, we know what the materials cost, we have a sense of how long it's gonna take us to make. But when we move into this space, no one knows what anything costs, let alone development or delivery, maintenance. And it's such a frustrating part because, and I think this is why the failure is so high. You're delivering things that will always cost more than the value they can produce, and you have no sense of like when are you way off base. But we don't have that with our other systems that we make. Like I'd never imagine an app for selling shoes that was totally off base. But we definitely do stuff in AI space like that.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to touch on is that all of you think really thoughtfully. All of you think really thoughtfully about the role that AI might take on in these creative processes, and what things AI might be particularly good at or well suited for, and what things AI might be less well suited for. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts when you're designing AI tools for creative processes. What tasks or parts of those creative workflows do you think AI excels at, and what areas do you think it might be more limited in?
One lens I go at it with is the creative process, and there's a bunch of creativity theory. You all probably very familiar with like divergent thinking, convergent thinking, double diamond model, where you might want to iterate through waves of generative and convergent processes. And a lot of the like early work that came out with AI was in the generative space. Naturally, you can get a lot of content out, you can have it explore lots of pathways very quickly. And a lot of my work is based in sort of community-driven design, and I find it's more and more interesting to think about the convergence problem. And I do believe an AI could take in a lot of information and come up with a solution. But at that point, you've really like separated the involvement of the community, if that's what happens. And so what I think is interesting going forward is how do we have AI in a supportive role around a community trying to like converge on something where there's a bunch of opposing viewpoints and different value systems at play, and where they maybe have to reach one decision and they all ideally appreciate or feel ownership of the result. It's not just an AI deciding what's best for the community, but it's we're deciding and the AI is supporting that. How we're going to do that, I think it's like a myriad of ways to do it, but that's what I'm excited about. It's not even the creative part, or part that people think about creativity is like the ideation part. That's a no-brainer. I think it's the other stuff that's more interesting. To go and work.
So I think two strengths that sometimes get overlooked. AI's got, particularly generative, has tremendous breadth. And it's figuring out how do I combine human expertise with that breadth to get to the thing that I can't get at now. The other superpower is it can forget absolutely. And so as a way of avoiding fixation of just forget everything, that's like with human designers, they can't. It like the fact that it's not emotionally invested in what you've done, it's never bored, it's never tired. That it's a superpower that we should not overlook as much as.
Have you used that? Like you in the middle of something about like, okay, forget everything you've learned to this point, be a dumb AI and come at it with fresh eyes.
So I want to say we're mostly going the other direction. We're making AI things, and so I think it's a recognition of when is that ability to forget absolutely valuable. And I don't know if you've seen Jun Wan's work. where they were using robots to talk to victims of domestic violence. This was in Korea, where maybe male police officers aren't amazingly good at this task. The AI was fine conversationally, but it excelled at just being able to purge everything it had heard, which provided tremendous comfort for the victims that were speaking with it. And so it's kind of recognizing that is super cool, but trying to figure out then where can we use this very non-human quality and like holding on to that. But I think it'd be the same in a creative process. Like we all get fixated, just like it out.
I'm curious. So I think something interesting that's come up for me in this conversation is that you talked about collectively agency, a lot of it coming from the person who's using the tool. So you have agency if you bring your own domain expertise to this interaction. If you're sort of literate in the domain, if you've already suffered in the domain, to bring back Josuke's point from earlier, or if you come to it sort of with the right motivation, like you're using this tool with particular motivation, then you can maintain agency while you're interacting with this tool, which is kind of a different angle from how I've been thinking about how like when we design these tools, how do we design them to support agency? But if we're thinking about it from a human perspective, people bringing their own agency. Anyways, my question here is, how does that differ for experts versus novices in a creative domain? And I'm curious, because I think you all collectively work with a different range of expertise. If we're thinking about a creative domain, if you're an expert in that domain, are there different design considerations for the tool and its ability to sort of support your agency versus if you're a novice and you're just learning this creative task for the first time?
It's a great question. I think almost all of the stuff we've been talking about, I would caveat with, it really depends on the task and who's doing it, how much expertise you have, as to what kind of support makes sense in that team or in that creative process. And is there wisdom to share? I don't know, but I know that you've been focusing a lot on scaffolding learners in more of like a creative learner context. They need to have better affordances to know what they can and can't do. But the other half of that is to know how to embed that wisdom in the interface to structure how the novice interacts with it. You need to know something about how the expert thinks about it. And so I think creativity support tools in general are about distilling what experts have learned into a playable form where it can allow novices to kind of walk up and act like an expert faster. Obviously not as fast, but so that's the part that I think needs more attention. How do you distill the expertise in a way that maybe allows you to support those coming into the community?
Yeah, I was going to say it's very similar, like the old learner-centered design work with scaffolding is to help learners engage in more authentic versions of expert practice, right? And so you try to, scaffolding is take away the really frustrating, tedious parts of what experts do to let learners experience without having to fill out abstraction and like learn, all of the stuff that takes years and years to accumulate. Whereas an expert maybe is that stuff is interesting or important, or so the way we're thinking a lot about AI tools right now and like is kind of along those lines.
Maybe you have to suffer though.
That,
You shouldn't try to shortcut
yes.
expertise. Because I do think the distinguishing factor is that people who think about it critically or keep going and persevering in the face of some challenge, or if they figure it out themselves. That's a great quality.
We work
How do you
with
teach that?
Right, we work with fifth graders, helping them create musical compositions. Okay, fifth graders don't know how to make musical compositions. It sounds terrible, right? Like to anyone who hasn't heard any music at all, right? But the mistake we make is that fifth graders, they created it, they love it. Like to them, it sounds amazing. And the mistake we make is too early going in and saying, oh, here we can scaffold it so that your stuff sounds like to us what we think of as amazing. And so we kind of take away that opportunity for students to explore too quickly. And that's, yeah, it's not exactly your question, but that's what.
I think I'll just add real quick. I think I see that tension also in students, like just in my practice, like learning how to write. That like they feel like they can't write anything that's as good as the AI. But that doesn't mean that what they write isn't valuable for their own learning processes and isn't something they should be proud of when they're producing it for the first time.
It reminds me of, do you ever read Margaret Bowden's work on creativity? She talked about big C creativity and small c. Big C is you're making a creative contribution to the world. Like small c would be like, my 4-year-old's little cartoon sketch. And it's not that creative to the world, but it's creative to him. And I guess that's an interesting question to think about with AI. How does AI affect small c and big C creativity? Is it supporting both, or what do you think, John?
I think, like, building on that, going back to the first panel, which I think maybe was super interesting, but that like the conception was artists, never craftsperson. We're like baking cookies, right? Baking's a craft, right? That you do it like because the doing of it is
Meaningful.
Yeah, and that then the outcome is also like it's not like you don't care about it, but it's about the doing.
Yeah.
And
we've seen those cookies before, right?
Yeah.
It's not reinventing the wheel.
Well, and I think like my own experience of coming from film, you don't work in the film industry because the movies you make are any good, because but you do it because there's a social pleasure in making things together and practicing your craft, even though you know it's a total turd and this is just like I've been paid. But I'm on a journey with the people. I think we become too fixated on the outcome and not like the particularly social pleasure of doing things with others. And I think there's an untapped opportunity to really think about how AI supports that aspect of it.
But then there's also something about the thick practice of baking cookies day in, day out, that like innovation creeps into that sort of
the end user innovation.
Like, right, like I just accidentally threw some ingredient in there that I didn't even realize, and I saw something amazing come out of that process. And so it's like that, like deep
Eric Van Tippel at MIT written books about the user innovation, like the hardcore whatever skateboarders creating their own rigs to be able to do jumps that you haven't seen before.
Right.
Like doing it every day is what leads to those actual big C contributions.
I think that I don't know if this is a question as much as it is a synthesis comment, but I think like I'm hearing a little bit that we might want AI to play a different role in creative workflows if we're an artist using AI as a tool to create interesting things versus if we're someone that's trying to learn a craft or a practice and trying to develop our own innovation and practice in that space versus like I said, kind of back to those learning and craft. But I think there might be a difference there in terms of how the role we want AI to play in our creative workflows. And maybe we don't want to hand off so much to AI when we're trying to develop our own practices. I wanted to ask a little bit, because I don't think we've talked about this much today. What methods do you think we might want to be using when we're thinking about evaluating how AI affects our creative processes, or trying to understand how the introduction of AI in creative workflows affects our creativity or our creative process?
We are thinking a lot about measures, like how, like looking at process models of creativity for learners in particular. It's trying to think about how would we measure some aspect of process, be able to sort of like say that's evidence of creativity. It's really kind of hard and it gets philosophical pretty quick. Like you can look at superficial things like iteration, but it's very hard to capture something like divergent thinking and say, oh yes, this is evidence of like looking at log data or looking at video or looking at outcome artifacts that's evidence of they were engaging in divergent thinking, and then there was a winnowing process where they're kind of coming back to like a convergent moment. Like, so I think my answer is I don't. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not like maybe I could do like a lot of ethnography and try to analyze it for myself, but it's very hard to. I don't know, come up with convincing methods.
I would say the same, but a couple more concrete answers. One is Max has a workshop coming up at Chi looking at this very topic, creative traces or creative activity traces. I always think about it as like measure everything you can. And usually it falls in the space of what do people do? What do they create? What's the output of the thing? You know, so process the output, and then how do they think or feel, perceive their experience of working? And like if we can measure stuff from all three categories, so I still use like the CSI, the Creativity Support Index. You know, we try to log anything we can about the process, and then we have various tricks of measuring the output. Right? You can point to some of my postdoc work where you literally measure the creative outcome of the ad or whatever that they create. There's a lot you can do to have experts look at that and rate it. I think the other thing we try to do is computational methods on the output. So we can look at how different is their idea compared to other people. And there's arguments around, you know, are you getting a diverse set of results from that intervention, or are you getting a kind of narrow set of results? Also kind of building on that homogenization work that we saw at CNC a couple of years ago. So I think the answer really is we're still figuring it out, and the best is to try to measure everything you can.
I'm gonna give maybe a terrible answer. And say, I think at least my group, we've learned a lot from social media companies doing bad things, but in interesting ways. So with like early days in UX, like if someone said they liked it, or if they could complete a task, we were like, that's success. But the social media companies really leaned into what is valuable for the enterprise. So it's engagement, it's survival, right? It's all of these different factors. So I'm not saying those are the ones we want, but it's this idea that when we're defining a tool, are we actually thinking of all the different kinds of value that it might produce, and then instrumenting it in ways to notice if it's producing this. So I kind of building on what you said, but there's this upfront work that's really saying, I'm looking for something very downstream. Like if you use this tool 10 years later, are you still practicing in the same way? Like, yeah, what's that sense of abandonment? Can I see growth? Like I'll come back to like the education because it's so broken. But we give students grades, which is like a terrible summary. It's like the worst you have been reduced to a grade, and then everybody's, or you know, the amount of grade grubbing. But like, why isn't my 89.4 an A? Because that's all they take away. I feel like how can we kind of bring this into our work of thinking, what are the actual measures? What makes an effective learner, and how do they take that with them as evidence? Like if I have a student that starts off struggling and is excellent at the end, they get a B, right? The A student was the person who found it easy from the beginning to the end, but as an employer, probably want that B student, right? Because they're showing they can persist, they can grow, they can overcome challenge, and that is definitely not the signal that our grades put into the world, and it drives people to like take classes where they feel I have a high percentage chance. So I'm curious how we bring this into thinking about like the measures we impose on others.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's like Stephen brought up this idea of like process, output, and feelings. of using AI in a creative workflow, as well as like the kinds of value that AI adds to the creative workflow. And I think it raises this question of sort of like, what does success look like when you introduce AI in a creative process? Because I can see some tensions emerging there where maybe people feel that they're having a really creative time with AI and they feel very much in control and ownership of the product. But then in actuality, the product shows that maybe they weren't very creative, or maybe they produce something less creative than they would have without the AI. And so I'm curious, and I'm sure this is contextually dependent, but I'm curious what you think about when you think about what success looks like when introducing AI in the creative process.
I want to answer your question in a different way, but I'd like to give people a chance to answer your question. I guess, I'm thinking about the failure states that you can get into with AI. You could have, you can give too much power over to the AI, and it looks like being lazy. It looks like being, having too much faith, I guess, in something that may not deliver. Or you could be fearful. You maybe think it's too powerful, and therefore I'm not going to give over my power to it. So it's achieving a good agency, I think, is somewhere between, affected by your expectations of what AI can do and how much you're willing to give over to that process. And like achieving good agency is somewhere balancing between those failure states. Staying away from it because I'm fearful it'll make me less creative, or and having too much faith into it where you don't feel full agency over it because you've given it too much power. And so I think finding that healthy balance of how much understanding what it can do and like allowing it to do what it's good at.
I'm really struggling with the word success because like I guess if I'm engaging in creative work for some end, or like advertising that I want to create an advertisement that's going to generate my company money, then maybe I have an objective measure of success. If I'm engaging in creative work because I like baking cookies, right? Like it is meaningful in and of itself, then I don't know how does the AI make it feel like the work is more meaningful? I don't know. If I'm a learner and I'm engaging in a creative process, oftentimes we want creativity, like the understanding how to engage in full cycle creative processes is a learning outcome that we're interested in. That's different. And so I'm stuck.
I would add, I think based on a project, you have to determine how paternalistic you are.
Very.
And sometimes you are really trying to embed your values into others. And that's okay as long as you know that's what you're trying to do. And like one example I use with my students to help them think of their action space. Do you guys know Edward Bernays, the kind of founder of, founder of public relations. So my favorite example of his was he got hired to sell books, like I think Doubleday books. And instead of trying to convince people to read, because that's hard, he got architects to build bookshelves in the entry halls of homes, knowing that people would feel their neighbors would come over and judge them. And I want to say, this has nothing to do with reading, right? Because this is about buying books. So you want to be very clear on what the goal is. You can be very paternalistic in design. So when we're designing AI tools for learning, I think there's a question of, does the learner want to learn, or do I want them to learn? And you should be very clear which one of those you're really trying to achieve. And both are fine, but you have to deal with the morality of the situation that you're in.
With that, I want to open up to the audience for questions. Maybe let's go back here to Kai.
Hi, thank you so much, panelists. I'm Kai, I'm a PhD student here, in the Department of Data Technology, right? So we've been talking a lot about agency today, and I feel like there's almost this assumption that agency is necessarily desirable or advantageous. Like we don't want to give up our agency to AI. But do you feel that there are situations where maybe agency might be undesirable or even harmful, where we actually want to offload it to the AI?
Yeah, totally. We often don't want responsibility, and agency always comes with responsibility. So I'm gonna put this much more in human
Not all
terms.
this, but yeah.
If you look at like teens and parents, there's this conflicting set of desires where teens want independence to do things, but they want to feel taken care of. Parents want to parent, but they want their kids to learn responsibility. So they're both working with this two sets of conflicting goals, constantly trying to resolve it. At the other end, and that one, that's kind of rough. The other end, I think it's much rougher. So you have aging parents of adult kids who now need to cede agency that they don't necessarily want to cede, but it's for sort of a bigger collective good, safety, and their kids don't necessarily want the responsibility of, oh, my mom's not safe to drive, but I don't want to have to take her keys away, right? That's going to be unpleasant. Well, I'm just going to pretend this isn't happening. So it's not like human to human, it's super messy. Human to AI is not any less messy. There's no like, oh, this is the obvious answer.
Yeah, I would give a similar, I have a couple of reactions, but one is in a learning community, which, I think every community is a form of that, where new people are coming in and kind of learning the practice, right? Legitimate peripheral participation. When you're first entering in, you kind of want to just sit there and be part of the community and observe without real agency. You don't want the community turning to you for like a decision. Let me sit back and watch. I'll have lower agency for now. Thank you. Until I figure out the way of this practice. And then the other reaction was going back to like the interactive media idea that sometimes you want to play a game, sometimes you want to watch a show and have no agency over the narrative. I just want to be along for the ride. Those are just two examples I can think of.
Kai, would you ask the question?
I think I'm just thinking also like harmful agency, like in what ways could it also be like potentially dangerous to creativity or how people interact with one another?
Harmful agency. Can you say more? Should you by that?
I don't know. It's more of like maybe like antisocial behavior, how people use AI. Honestly, one of the motivating things is we've been talking a lot about how agency operates on a spectrum, right? And then I was thinking like, are there cases where we actually don't want to have the humans really have the agency to control? Like, what if it was we can be by accident? Yeah, there wasn't like a clear like thing I had in mind, but I wanted to know from your expertise and thoughts about that.
I do wonder like how much people in general believe that AI has agency, and there's that like see agency to systems as a way to like almost like avoid the responsibility of the decisions that come out of those agencies. So we're like, for example, we're thinking about machine learning use in housing decisions. So like deciding who gets housing vouchers, so process lots of data, and as like an individual human working for the state of Illinois, I don't actually have to make these hard decisions. I can sort of cede that agency over to the algorithms and in a way that kind of absolves some of the responsibility that maybe those decisions are.
We had a class on AI innovation in healthcare. And one of my favorite projects was hated by almost all the students, but this one team decided to make an agent that bullies teens And with the idea that when you grow up in an environment that's too sterile, you don't become robust, so could it bully you just enough? To me, there was like a brilliant joy in this totally socially inappropriate, but it's like there's something there in the tension, and I think we shouldn't try to make perfect things, but that messy noise actually reveals new opportunities. But I should say, all the other student teams hated that concept.
Your other questions, Agnes?
So this conversation made me think about recent research that looked at a very simple setting of divergent creativity, comparing human participants with LLMs, and on average, it seems that the LLMs produced more creative output from this measure, but the best humans were still way better. So I wanted to hear your reactions to this, and maybe along the just what's missing. So it's very reassuring that the best humans were still way better than LLMs, but what are the LLMs or AI? What is AI still missing? And where will the next development, specifically for creativity assistance, if you have any ideas?
I still think it's part of the answer is in this idea of thick practice, right? Like that innovation grows out of practice, and like artists suffer because of learning.
And you think that LLMs or AI is just not in its current form, not reproducing that process, and hence it's not there with the best humans. And if we would fix that, then it would be there.
It's sort of hard to imagine that coming out of a system that's that grown as like the AI systems learn by we feed it like data as opposed to it experiencing the world. It's, Nick is giving me a look, so that's okay. Well, or you just practice.
I have an image of some fat from AI.
Oh, I see. On the other hand, like if you think of AI as like, I'm sorry, if you think of creativity as being able to combine multiple literacies, like it's really fun to plug in, go into Suno and say, hey, I want a song that combines themes of sushi, heartbreak, and ice cream, and it will just produce the most joyfully like fluent, lyrics that combine those themes in really fun ways. And so like, like the systems are going to be way more literate in way more languages and forms than I can ever be as a human being. So
I think that the like reading between the lines of your study that you quoted is that you have a spectrum of like people there. Some of them are really creative. That's the spectrum, and some of them are less creative, probably even less creative to the LLMs than the LLMs. And so the answer is there are many things missing, right? And the question is on that spectrum, what can we do to kind of boost the people who are not creative? Which I think are different things than we do to boost the people or support the people who are already creative. And that the sort of the AI, it's very different, I think, at those levels of the spectrum. So there isn't one thing missing. I think that it gives us lots of opportunities, all of us, to keep innovating.
Yeah.
So thinking about the themes of the panel agency and creativity, I'm wondering about kind of the long-term societal impacts of this. And I wanted to kind of prompt the panel to speculate a little bit and maybe imagine 10 years from now. If you were to talk to people working in a creative industry 10 years from now, would they say they have more agency, the same amount of agency, or less agency than if you had asked them today, using like today's version of the tools? So a little bit of the speculation, but where is this moving over the longer time frame?
So what I would say, like, I think we have to reframe now. And I'm gonna place this in a highly commercial practice, not home art practice. But if you're doing highly creative work, TV commercials, whatever, but you're for a check, your biggest barrier is socializing the idea, not coming up with ideas. That is the part that's really hard, trying to penetrate the C-level, trying to get a film producer to take a risk. That's the barrier, not are there good ideas? And I don't think that's going to change. But it's, I'm curious if creative people will begin to use AI to make them better at pitching, at putting their idea in the form that the gatekeeper understands the value to the gatekeeper better than the creative can do right now.
And you would argue that would increase their agency?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Because they suck at that. Like, it's weird, but they're really, really bad at interact. Like the most creative people I know struggle to just interact with people. They can't turn it off, right? And like turn the volume down. Or you have an art director that's playing that role, right? And they're the shield between the creative team and management. But I think AI, there are opportunities there.
Yeah, I guess the long-term fears are that it causes brain rot. We're lazy learners. We don't have to learn anymore because we know that anything we need to know is right at our fingertips. It certainly happened that way with phone numbers. We don't memorize them anymore. Decision making, are we less critical, less thoughtful about the decision because we know there's a decision ready at hand from the AI? Do we explore less? Do we feel less ownership over the creative product if it was co-created with AI? Probably not, because of what you're saying. You still have to ultimately take ownership and like get it over the line into the place where it's going to play. So I think all of those things are going to get recalibrated as people work with it and sort of readjust their expectations, and then sort of they'll adjust as if they go too far the wrong way and realize they're being too lazy, they'll self-adjust. If they've maybe made some decisions too much and like took an output from an LLM as truth, but actually there was a misinformation or something, they'll recalibrate their expectations. So that's my silver lining, is that people will figure it out and that we'll still feel just as much ownership, just as much creativity, but it might look a little different. Like it's maybe not, managing pixels, but we're still driving the process and being engaged in different ways. And
so the line is moving, but we feel like it's the same in essence.
And then we'll readjust so that we still feel the purpose in the work that we're doing.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's very cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked that question. I was kind of thinking about the idea that like it's coming out that like a lot of the role of AI and these processes depends on who's in the room. Like who do we have involved in this creative process, and who's bringing what expertise? And I'm curious how that changes over time as like expertise in a field changes, what it means to be an expert in a field changes. When all the people on a team working with the AI have suddenly not done the process without AI before. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an interesting question. Other questions? At least one more. David?
Thank you so much. This is super exciting. So we talked a lot about agency, and then just in general, this is not all my question. This is the entire talk, not my question. This is my question. We talked a lot about agency, and then we talked about the relationship a little bit between agency and the perception of ownership over your creative work. I'm curious about what role those conceptions have in like objective ownership questions, and someone very briefly mentioned copyright. So that's what I'm kind of thinking about here is like, I think a lot of lawyers are kind of looking to us in HCI to say, okay, one of the distinctions we'd like to make is what does it mean to use something as a tool versus as an agent, and that would make some meaningful lines in ownership of generated works. And so I'm curious about what gap there is between perceived ownership versus like actual ownership, as well as what our role is as like kind of HCI design plus in thinking about how we can understand what it means to own something from a copyright perspective.
That's kind of what I was asking about, I think with the last panel, when I was referencing, these models consume the New York Times, they consume whatever artist's work, and you get an image, it's literally reproducing art from other people. So we have we can't see into the models, we don't know what exactly it's pulling from, but it has that Picasso feel to it, so we know it's in there. So I don't know, I don't have an answer to that one, but that's part of it, I think, is that you're not just trying to credit whatever AI or service they're using. You also maybe should be crediting the underlying data model.
A lot about music and how artists are constantly reusing material and repurposing material. And I think we as a society get upset when we feel like material is repurposed without attribution. It's almost like it feels like they're trying to reuse material that without
It's really obvious.
Yeah.
The thing in music though is you have all of these songs that are actually really inspired by each other. And as you're listening to all this stuff, and it's like it's in your musical blood. But there's been these cases. I think there's a famous one with what's his name? Pharrell got sued over a song that sounded like an older song. And he talked about how that sets a very dangerous precedent, right?
Right. You can't copyright a chord progression, I think was one. Yeah.
How can you copyright a chord progression? It almost feels like nature. Like that sequence of chords should be usable by anyone, but that okay, interesting. I have some chord combinations I can suggest.
And I think back to like when I'm writing, right, I'll often write about it's like a really cool phrase I just invented, and like no, it turns out like 6 people have thought of putting design in harm's way before I ever thought of that, right? Like and I'm not even realizing or recognizing that like that's pretty. And so like I think AI is a really interesting case in where we're amplifying the ability to sort of produce derivative work without understanding ourselves the provenance of the and that feels.
It is in a way it feels the same though, because you may not know that you're using that chord progression that's in that old song that you heard once.
So I will just add like the creatives I've worked with that have sort of gone on to really do well, quit caring about ownership. That is the idea, like, oh, that was mine. That meant you had an idea in a moment, but you didn't continue to work on it into the world. And that when you're just making a lot of things a lot of the time, you don't care about any of them that much. It's the doing, not the thing.
The companies still care about it.
That's totally different
lawyers.
thing.
The patent lawyer, the lawyers that do patents. And
well, let's move past capitalism. We're gone now.
So now we're moving past capitalism, and I felt around 4 minutes over time. So we're wrap up the panel on that note. Let's give a round of applause.